Thank you. If you live in time, you want it to go fast. When you look back at it, it has gone too quickly. I often wish my time away. I'm always a future person. Now I can't see beyond tomorrow. I can't see anything except what I've lost. The words of these patients, spoken in their psychoanalytic sessions, highlight the ways in which experiences of time interweave our lives. In my book, Time in Practice, I argue for the crucial importance in the psychoanalytic relationship of an attentiveness to patients' and analysts' temporal experiences in both their conscious and their unconscious aspects. Although psychoanalytic theorizing implicitly addresses the theme of time, it's often not explicitly articulated. Freud's concepts of the unconscious, regression, displacement, condensation, and transference, for example, all rely on notions of time which remain unthematized. Heated debates between analysts as to what constitutes efficacy in psychoanalysis refer implicitly to time, the length and the frequency of the sessions, the length of the analysis and breaks in the analysis, whether instigated by the analyst or the patient. Questions about time are intrinsic to those regarding memory and forgetting, embodiment, language, the continuity and or discontinuities of identities, the socio-historical specificity of the subject, the significance of death for us in our lived present, and of change. In considering the relevance of temporality to psychoanalytic practices, it's necessary to distinguish lived time from our ordinary conceptions of time as cosmological and datable. As Mann's 1924 novel, The Magic Mountain, so poignantly exemplifies, abstract notions of time as motion, as linear or circular, as change or as datable, can never encapsulate the temporality of human experience. Mann explores in fictional form the effects on patients in a sanatorium of the imposition of its particular time, the time of the doctors, a time which differs radically from that which is lived beyond its walls. In the sanatorium, the smallest unit of time is the month, and in decisions regarding the length of treatments for patients, doctors treat weeks as if they were only days. Mann's reflections on time are voiced through the musings of a central character, Hans Karstop. Karstop's time as a patient underlines for him that the time of the calendar, the units of minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, and years are, I quote, purely arbitrary, sheer conventions. The second hand on a watch may complete the same circuit each time to indicate the passing of a minute, but our experience of the time it takes is variable. For Karstop, most often days in the sanatorium are exceedingly long, yet retrospectively, in their emptiness, they seem to, I quote, scurry by like dead leaves, indistinguishable from today, blending into the always, quote. Since the sanatorium is up in the mountains, even the calendar cycle of the seasons is non-existent. There are spring and autumn days, burning hot summer days in winter, and snowfall in the summer, all incongruent with the seasons designated arbitrarily by the calendar. Mann's novel conveys vividly the operations of institutionalization in temporal terms, and its alienating effects on the patient's subjectivity. Time is organized such that one should get used to things, I quote, even if the getting used consisted in getting used to not getting used. The questions which Mann raises through his character Karstop regarding the relation between cosmological time, datable time, and lived time extend far beyond the particular context of the institution that he describes in the novel. The impossibility of an exact correlation between, for example, the times of sunrise, sunset, and planetary movements, and any system of calendar time, indicate that time and dates are relative, not absolute. In this paper, I highlight why an attunement to experiences of lived time in all three dimensions matters in clinical practice. Our interpretations of our patient's speech are unavoidably embedded in concepts of temporality, which we bring to the analytic work, consciously and unconsciously. I'll focus particularly on the question of change or cure. I begin with a discussion of Freud's view of the unconscious as timeless and its implications for change in psychoanalytic work. Throughout his writing, Freud claims that unconscious processes are, I quote, not ordered temporally, time does not change them in any way, and the idea of time cannot be applied to them. Developing this, Freud argues that the wishful impulses arising from the id and the impressions that have been repressed are, I quote, virtually immortal, and their effects on the individual remain unchanged. He stresses that his realization of the timelessness of the unconscious has profound philosophical implications, but acknowledges that he's unable to develop his understanding of this any further. What are the implications of Freud's view of the unconscious as atemporal? From one perspective, it's a very radical conception in its implicit recognition that subjectivity is not always located within linear or chronological time, and it allows for more fluidity in our understanding of individuals' lived experiences of time, both consciously and unconsciously. In our dreams particularly, time is rarely chronological and linear. We shift effortlessly between the immediacy of childhood and that of adulthood. We experience the anticipation of impending horrors and the longings for possible pleasures in which past and future are conflated. Babies talk to us in highly articulated adult concepts. Other dream characters die and come to life again. While we dream, we do not think of the events of the dream as belonging to our conscious or chronological past, or as pertaining to our conscious future. We live these events in the dream without such distinctions. Freud's view of the unconscious as timeless, however, reveals some significant contradictions. He describes the source of the drives as being in, I quote, in an organ or part of the body, and as exerting a constant force or pressure for which the drive seeks satisfaction. The timelessness of unconscious drives is related to this constancy. Later, he claims that repeated experiences of the ego over several generations are incorporated into the id and transmitted onto further generations phylogenetically. The portion of the id which the ego forms as the superego is therefore constituted through the restoration of numerous egos of previous generations and is inherited. How can the unconscious be timeless if the drives can nevertheless be altered, as Freud also claims? Quote, what has belonged to the lowest part of the mental life of each of us has changed into what is highest in the human mind by our scale of values. In 1915, he had expressed his cynicism as to how far drives can be transformed, arguing that, I quote, human nature consists of instinctual impulses which are of an elementary nature, which are similar in all men, and which aim at the satisfaction of certain primal needs. And also, he says, the primitive mind is imperishable. The notion of the unconscious as timeless produces problems for Freud in his theorizing of change or cure in psychoanalysis. Reflecting on the length of an analysis, he argues that the analyst should behave as timelessly as the unconscious itself. It's clear from his subsequent remarks that by this he means open-ended and lengthy, since this is likely to lead to a better prognosis for the patient, as well as a learning experience for the analyst. Freud, in 1937, argues that the criteria for the termination of an analysis are the relief of symptoms, consciousness of previously repressed material, and a lessening of resistance, such that a further recurrence of symptoms is unlikely. Through analysis, unconscious drives are tamed by the ego unless they are excessively strong. Quote. This implies that some drives can be modified through the controlling strength of the ego, and that therefore they are changeable and are implicitly subject to the passage of time. Freud qualifies his claim, however, by suggesting that if the drives are constitutionally strong, a fiction as a result of a trauma is more likely. Furthermore, some constitutional factors may not be amenable to treatment. It's interesting to note how Freud acknowledges his own questions regarding his discoveries. He admits that he is unclear about the relation between the ego and the constitutional strength of the drive. Raising the question as to whether its strength is responsible for the modification of the ego, he decides that since the ego itself has its own etiology, this may not be the case. Freud concludes, I quote, "It must be acknowledged that our knowledge of these relations is as yet imperfect." Avoiding pursuing these crucial contradictions further, he suggests that the question of cure should engage with the obstacles to change rather than how it occurs. Freud's notion of the unconscious as timeless has radical implications in its recognition that subjectivity is not lived within a linear chronological time. Unconsciously and often consciously, we slide and jump between past, present and future. Often we are driven to live aspects of the past as if they're our present. We may live in imagined futures instead of our present, or live in the present as if we have no past and no future, as in psychosis. However, the problem lies in his notion of unconscious instincts being beyond time, unchangeable and immortal. As the contemporary European philosopher Wood points out, it undermines the significance that Freud himself, in his theorizing of the transference and of the death instinct, attributes to repetition in its unconscious aspects. In Remembering, Repeating and Working Through, Freud describes the multiple ways in which our subjectivities are shaped by conscious and unconscious memories, memories which have displaced other memories, memories which underlie other memories, by fantasies which are not memories since they've never been forgotten, and in the case of obsessional neurosis, by an absence of connection between memories. In the Transference, action replaces memory. These different interpretations of how memory works, including Freud's questions as to what it means to forget, are an important contribution to expanding our sensitivity to individuals' differing relations to the past. The limitation of remembering, repeating and working through concerns Freud's emphasis on the importance of past time in this psychoanalytic method. He refers only briefly to the future in his recognition that an individual's neurosis contains things of value for his or her future life. Although Freud's concept of the drive implies that there's a future aim, Freud's focus is on how these aims or objects are determined by a person's past experiences. Fears in relation to the future, as for example in the anxious anticipation of a terrible event, are also interpreted by him in terms of their past. They have their source in a memory of a time when something that was feared did actually happen. Freud retains his conviction from Breuer's work with hypnosis to his own emphasis on free association and the analysis of resistances, that the psychoanalytic technique has remained the same. I quote, "Descriptively speaking, it is to fill gaps in memory. Dynamically speaking, it is to overcome resistances due to repression. The analyst must treat the patient's distress, I quote, as a present-day force, only to enable the patient's reconciliation with repressed material, and to transform the patient's compulsion to repeat in the transference into a, I quote, motive for remembering." The problem of Freud's emphasis on the past dimension of lived subjectivity is further revealed in a critical exploration of his concept of the transference. Although Freud states that the patient's illness must be treated, I quote, not as an event of the past, but as a present-day force, his notion of the transference prioritizes the past dimension of time and the patient's negotiation of developmental stages. He argues that in the transference, the patient does not remember anything of what he has forgotten and repressed, but acts it out. He repeats it not as a memory, but as an action. He repeats without knowing that he is repeating it. Freud claims, for example, that all experiences of, I quote, being in love reproduce infantile prototypes, and that emotional connections to others in the form of trust, friendship and sympathy are, I quote, genetically linked to sexuality and have their source in the sexual drive. As I emphasise above, in relation to Freud's notion of the unconscious as timeless, This doesn't sufficiently take into account the intersubjective specificity of these feelings and the role of language in their constitution. Freud's conceptualization of the transference as the compulsion to repeat also doesn't sufficiently allow for its role in relation to the patient's anticipation of his or her future, whether as a refusal of the future or as an experimentation with future possibilities. If analysts are not attuned to the specific ways in which their patients are oriented towards the future, there is a risk that patients' enmeshments in their past anxieties are prolonged. From my own clinical experience, it's crucial that unconscious and conscious, tentative, minute and precarious attempts at possibilities other than repetition of the past are attended to by the analyst. The following example illustrates the importance of an interpretation which addresses the patient's transference as a relation to their future. Jane telephoned me on the day before her session to cancel it. She had a week off work as holiday leave and felt she would prefer also not to come to her session, an early morning appointment. She would see me again the following week at her usual time. In her next session, it emerged how important it was for Jane to cancel her session. It had taken her a lot of courage, she told me, since it felt to her that it was the first time she felt she'd really said to somebody that she didn't want to do what they expected, and that there was something else she would rather do. Her relation with her mother had been one in which she felt she'd had to meticulously anticipate and meet all her mother's needs. For her, unconsciously, if she didn't do this, her mother's life would be at risk. Jane had been nervous of my response and struggled with her wish to protect me. She was also excited that she had managed to choose to do what she herself had wanted. In the transference, Jane was certainly reenacting an aspect of her past experience with her mother, whom she perceived as fragile. However, more importantly, the therapy allowed her a playground in which to experiment with new possibilities of future relationships, which need not be completely controlled by her desire to please her mother. In Remembering, Repeating and Working Through, Freud uses the metaphor of a playground to describe the transference. However, his emphasis is on its relation to the past. It can, I quote, expand in almost complete freedom and display everything in the way of pathogenic instincts that is hidden in the patient's mind in order to become a motive for remembering. However, as the work with Jane illustrates, the transference may also offer a way of playing with new possibilities of future ways of relating. In Lacan's theorizing of desire and of repression, he, by contrast with Freud, explicitly introduces the notion of a future. Desire, he argues, arises from the unconscious, and I quote, conveys what it maintains of an image of the past towards an ever short and limited future. It brings forth a new presence in the world. In relation to repression, he concludes that repression and the return of the repressed are the same thing, since all repression, in his view, is retrospective. This means that the return of the repressed comes from the future and not the past. The erased signal of something takes on its value from the future, from its integration into symbolic language, and its subsequent integration into the subject's history. I quote, literally, it will only ever be a thing which at a given moment of its occurrence will have been. Thus, for Lacan, very subtle temporal shifts occur in repression as subsequent meanings continue to replace one another retrospectively within the context of a future. I return later to the question of the relation between language and temporality. The question of the individual's orientation to the future is a very strong feature in Jung's writing. He characterizes the unconscious as being like Janus facing two ways. It has a historical aspect pointing towards the past and an anticipatory aspect pointing towards the future. Jung stresses that it's important for the analyst to decide, I quote, whether an autonomous manifestation of the unconscious should be interpreted as an effect and therefore historical, or as an aim and therefore teleological and anticipatory. He explicitly addresses how individuals are oriented to their futures with all their hopes, fears, desires, and intentions in a myriad of ways which shift according to the present context, and how this is evident in the Transference. In his theorizing of neurosis, Jung argues that it occurs, I quote, at the moment when a new psychological adjustment, that is, a new adaptation, is demanded. He questions what it is in the present which the patient is not able or willing to accomplish, since, he claims, it's the failure to adjust to a new situation which leads to regression and an exaggeration of infantile fantasies. Neither these nor any fixation to them, he argues against Freud, are the cause of present experiences. Regression to these fantasies is instead a way of avoiding present conflict. Jung claims that conscious and unconscious preoccupation with the future is intensified toward the end of an analysis. This assumption does not, however, sufficiently take into account the possibility that an individual may begin analysis, partly because they are overly focused on the future. In this case, the end of analysis may bring a lessening of this preoccupation. Jung's view of the subject as extending backwards and forwards through time appears to converge with Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological view of temporality. However, Merleau-Ponty goes further in claiming that we must conceive of the subject as temporality itself, both thrusting and being thrust towards the future. I quote, "We must understand time as the subject and the subject as time." And this has implications for intersubjectivity. His emphasis on lived time is crucial for analytical practices, which attend to the specificity of individuals' relations to time. Phenomenology is a method of describing experience, not an empirical, deductive, or inductive theory of the reality of our existence. Merleau-Ponty argues that time is perspectival. For the subject, the past is a former future and a recent present, the present an impending past and a recent future, the future a present and even a past to come. So, quote, "Time is a dimension of our existence, a network of intentionalities, and we are carried forward by lines of intentionality which trace out the style of our futures. These lines don't originate in us. We are situated within a perceptual field which is run through with retentions and pretensions. Retention refers to the transition of a present moment into the past whilst remaining present, and protension refers to the overlap between the present and the impending future moment. Although past, present and future are distinguishable, they are nevertheless embraced within a single flux which is present." Merleau-Ponty addresses the intersubjective aspects of temporality in his theorizing of sedimentation. He argues that in our relations with others, we accumulate a background of shared meanings which inform our conversations without our needing to reassemble them on every occasion. They constitute a sediment, this is a quote, "a sediment left by our mental processes which enables us to rely on our concepts without there being any need for us to resynthesize them. This sediment is not, however, an inanimate layer within us, but a dynamic process whereby every acquired meaning is revivified by a present thought." Merleau-Ponty's notion of sedimentation allows for the role of language in the acquisition and retention of historical and cultural meanings, which are the matrices of meaning constituting our being in the world. The stories of patient experiences told in the present in the consulting room shift from present to past to future and back. Contained within each of these dimensions are others' presents, pasts and futures, extending back and forwards through time. His conceptualization of shared meanings contrasts with Jung's notion of the collective unconscious, which he claims is inherited and universal outside time, and which therefore doesn't take into account, as Merleau-Ponty's does, the socio-historical and culturally specific. Merleau-Ponty's work raises the question of the relation between the time of the analyst and the time of the patient, and whether these can ever be regarded as constituting the same time. The following case example, which is a composite one in order to preserve confidentiality, highlights how the threat of others' time emerges as a strong theme in the analytic work. In his 46 years, Kevin had never worn a watch, and he was stubborn in his refusal to submit to others' time. Railing against his age, he dressed impeccably in the style of a challenging 20-year-old. Every garment was up to the minute, as he put it. Kevin was from a northern working-class family and was the second youngest of 7 children. There was 6 years between himself and the youngest child, a sister, whom he said he'd always hated and had now lost touch with, and for whom he was expected to be responsible. He said, "I had no parents and I was supposed to parent her." His mother had been extremely depressed after his and also his sister's birth. She tried several times to leave Kevin's father, sometimes with and sometimes without the children. Kevin's father had had what he called